AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.
Gary.
John, how are you?
I'm doing okay. I feel like I'm back in the saddle. I missed last week's show. I was out of town, so it's good to be here.
And we're glad to have you back. We're going to talk about some serious stuff today, but I've got to talk about something slightly more whimsical to begin the show with.
Good.
So I would argue that one of the most famous cars in the world is the DeLorean DMC-12.
Yeah.
Anybody knows, the Back to the Future car,
right?
And you could talk to housewives, you could talk to retired, anybody would know what that vehicle is. So it just so happens that 41 years ago today, John DeLorean was arrested in a sting by the FBI for a $24 million cocaine deal.
Right.
That's just completely mind-boggling to me.
That's how bad it got, right? How desperate he was. He resorted to selling coke to try to save the company.
So that's just so crazy to think about that. There was a guy in the industry. He'd worked at, General Motors for Pontiac for many, 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 many years, and then started his own company, came up with this car. And, again, a legendary looking car that was designed by a guy by the name of Bill Collins.
Yeah, I knew Bill Collins.
Who died this last March. And and
remember, to complete the story, DeLorean was acquitted, right?
Yeah.
His lawyers were successfully able to argue that it was entrapment, that the FBI actually trapped him into selling cocaine.
Right.
But he was very willing to do it. Entrapment or not, he was a willing participant.
Mm-hmm. So that's our Marty McFly moment for the day. So let's go with the show.
Let's get on with the show. Let's bring everybody in. We've got Bob Chiaravalli from Strategic Labor and Human Resources, Keith Naughton from Bloomberg, and Paul Eisenstein from Headlight.News. Great having you all here.
Great.
And Bob, we want to talk about the strike. You are the true labor expert. We all follow this, right? But you've been in the thick of this your entire career. What do you make of where we're at right now? And let me set the stage this way. They got a hell of a contract negotiated already. They got just about every damn thing that Shawn Fain wanted, and yet this thing's dragging on. So what do you make of what's going on?
Well, you and I have talked, and there was a real inflection point that started all of this down the path. And that's when the monitor over the UAW, Neil Borowski, signed with just a stroke of the pen a change to how they elected their leadership from what used to be called the Ruther Caucus, basically a delegate form of elections, to a one member, one vote. And whenever you give all the members a vote, crazy things can happen. Anyways, they threw out the old leadership and they brought in the new leadership. And that is truly the inflection point, in my estimation, of what we're seeing today. And what we're seeing today, back when this first started with that vote, I knew it was going to be chaotic. Matter of fact, at the time I was doing some speaking with MEMA, and I actually labeled the presentation Chaos in Labor Relations. Who wouldn't have known that it would have been this chaotic?
Yeah. And just to establish your bona fides for the audience here, the Justice Department brought you in to help them oversee all what was going on there.
Yeah, so most of your viewers know that there was a big scandal between what was used to be called FCA and the UAW, which involved embezzlement of a lot of funds. And as the UAW and FCA pled guilty to the criminal charges, part of the plea agreement required that they engage monitors to oversee their labor relations. And I was engaged by the Department of Justice with two forensic accountants to oversee Stellantis, and then Neil Borowski was appointed by the Department of Justice to oversee the UAW.
Yeah. Keith, you're following this. Especially from the Ford side, right?
Absolutely.
And what do you? Last week, was it last week or this week? Things are going so fast I can't even keep track. This week, Bill Ford came out, and the guy was practically down on his knees begging the union to stop the strike.
Yeah, Ford has offered a 23% raise, which, just stop for a second and think of the last time you received a 23% raise.
Like never.
And so, and then if you fold in COLA, which Ford has agreed to restore, as has GM, as has Stellantis, then you actually get up to around a 30% raise, which was kind of the new bogey we were told by our sources that Shawn Fain had. So as soon as Ford got to that bogey, then things changed. Then it was, wait, we need the battery plants, as part of the deal. We want the battery plants to be in the master agreement, and GM has agreed to do so. So then, suddenly Ford didn't have the favored nation status that it seemed to have, and then the UAW kind of turned on them and took down Kentucky Truck, 8,700 workers. Ford now has more than 16,000 workers on strike out of a total of 34,000. So way more than GM and Stellantis have on strike. So Ford went from the penthouse to the doghouse.
So Keith, I want to ask you. So John mentioned that Bill Ford came out, made a presentation, and he said, "I've been silent. I haven't said anything." But when Kentucky Truck went down, now he had to speak. And to quote part of his presentation, he said, "I have been part of every negotiation since 1982 and have worked with every UAW leader from Doug Frazier to Ron Gettelfinger and Bob King. I have also been the most pro-union leader in our industry. On my watch, Ford is the only automaker to have added UAW jobs over the past 15 years. We employ more UAW workers than any other automaker." And then went on to say, "I call on my great UAW colleagues, some of whom I've known for decades. Many are close personal friends. We need to come together to bring an end to this acrimonious round of talks." I sort of got the feeling from that was he was setting himself up saying, "Hey, I'm a friend of the UAW friends that I've known going back to 1982, which presumably would not include Shawn Fain. Hey, let's come together on this." Did you get that sense at all?
Yeah, absolutely. And no, they didn't really know Shawn Fain. He came up through the Chrysler system, so it's not somebody Ford has dealt with. But they sure know Chuck Browning, who is the vice president for the Ford department, who's negotiated several contracts, and they have great relationships with him. Bill Ford plays hockey with UAW guys. He does have friendships with UAW folks, regular rank and file folks, high-ranking UAW folks. And Ford has always had the best relations. John can tell you that, has always had the best relations with the UAW of the three companies. And they feel like, no good deed goes unpunished here. They currently have the best economic offer on the table. And they're at a 23% raise. GM and Stellantis are around 20%. They were the first to offer COLA back. They have really made a pretty extraordinary economic offer, but where they haven't moved as much is on the battery plants. And that's where at least Shawn Fain says, GM really doesn't talk about it, but Shawn Fain says GM has agreed to have the battery plants as part of the UAW's master agreement, which is extraordinary because we talk about these battery plants. They, for the most part, with the exception of one, GM Ultium plant in Ohio, all of the battery plants we're talking about are under construction. They have no workers yet. They have not been organized by the UAW. And yet, GM, according to Shawn Fain, has agreed to put them under the UAW master agreement before there are workers who have voted to join the UAW. That's
which some people say they can't really legally do. There's an argument to be made that workers actually have to vote. I see Bob shaking his head in agreement. I don't mean to cut you off, Keith, but one of the things I'm wondering if any of you folks agree, I actually thought that Shawn Fain wanted a strike. And I still think he may have wanted a strike. And I still think he may want the strike to continue. I think Fain really believes he can squeeze incredible amounts out of these folks. But there's more. I also see Fain as somebody who has almost this grand vision, first of the UAW, again resuming its position as the exclusive union in the U.S. labor industry. And secondly, himself being elevated to some sort of demigod, the guy who is going to reinvigorate American labor after 40 years or more of the labor movement just continuing to decline. And certainly since Reagan fired the air traffic controllers. And if you look at what the UAW Fain's response was to Bill Ford's comments during that speech, very brief speech he made at the Rouge plant, it was quite interesting because he basically said, don't talk to us about Ford and the UAW. It's workers against the auto industry's greed, basically talking about the world of labor coming together, solidarity forever. And one of the fantasies of that quote was, we're going to represent the workers at Honda and Nissan and Toyota and VW and Tesla. And there's a chance Tesla could get a union because they're so screwed up. But the other automakers have basically, the workers at the other automakers have either said go away or they voted down unionization drives.
Yeah, but what Shawn Fain is betting on, Paul, is that the terms of this deal are going to be so rich that the workers at those factories who previously have turned away the UAW are now going to say, I want to sign up for that. I'll take a 30% raise. Sure, come on in.
Yeah,
Bob, hold on. I want to get Bob's input on that. What do you think, Bob? They're going to be able to organize the transplants and the startups?
Well, John, in the first 3 minutes of your show, there is so much swirling around in my head. I feel like a mosquito in a nudist camp. I know what I want to say. I just don't know where to start. I mean, this is such a rich conversation. First off, I've been in this business a very long time as an advisor and a labor lawyer. And I deal with 20 different international unions, generally all along the way from the top to the bottom. And nobody I know knows Fain. Very few of them, few of my colleagues know the leadership that was elected. And if you go around all the regions, almost to a T, all the old regional directors, not all of them, but almost all of them have been replaced. And the one thing I heard, I agree with 100%. This is an area for ideologues. I think somebody also said a demagogue. And I was telling John the other day that I read a quote. It said, the labor movement is industrial conflict with declining capitalism. Number two, a move to distinguish workers from capitalists, a move from capitalism to socialism, and a liberal use of strikes to pull out economic and political power. And I think I may have surprised you, John, when I said that quote came from 1920. And in the early part of the 1900s, the labor movement was controlled by a lot of ideologues, and there was many, many more strikes, and many of them were violent. And that's the cloth from which Fain is cut. And when you look at the major name brand unions in the automotive industry, including Unifor, the IBW, IUE, CWA, Steelworkers, Teamsters, almost every single one of their international leaders are recently elected. And with the IBT, O'Brien said the same thing Fain said. It's not, I don't care what's going to happen with the industry. I care about what's happening to working people. And if I have to bleed a little now for that ideology of the working class, I will do it. But who knows? This is not an industry that is cemented in America. It's not a railroad or a hospital or a institution that can't move. We will see just precisely who's going to be the winner of this 2, 3, 4 years from now. And, you know, I was looking back at some records when the UAW struck General Motors last time. The striking workers, from what they lost in wages during that strike, they still have not recouped it 4 years later. That's a pretty impressive statistic, that whatever they did to gain something, they still have not regained it.
Bob, when you're saying that it's not a hospital, it's not a railroad, are you suggesting that some of the OEMs might decide to move plants elsewhere?
I would say, because our industry is an extended enterprise, the dollar will find its best use among the OEMs and among the suppliers. And we went through restructuring in such a big way over the years, where we moved everything to low-cost countries, that it is within the realm of possibility. And I would fully expect location decisions to put places that will not have to suffer this risk, either in non-union settings, in different geographical settings within the United States, or following the dollar to its best use in low-cost countries. Absolutely.
All right, can I jump in for a second? There's a critical thing we have to remember. The Biden administration has creatively done something that at least gives a little support to the UAW and a heck of a lot of support to the American auto industry. And by that, I talk about any and everyone producing vehicles in the United States, or if you prefer, in North America, because of NAFTA 2, and that is the IRA. So it does put a whole bunch of restrictions on moving out of the U.S. Yes, you can move to Mexico and Canada to varying degrees, but all the incentive guidelines, they restrict where you can build them, where you can assemble the vehicles, where the batteries come from, where the raw materials come from. So in a sense, that does potentially help the UAW, but really not, because it doesn't really matter if it's Tesla, if it's Toyota, as long as they meet the same standards producing them here, that's fine. They're going to do great. And something to keep in mind, which sort of fits in this, but Keith, you were talking about before, it's all well and good to say to workers down in Kentucky or Texas or wherever any of the transplants are, that look at how much money we made. Well, we know exactly what's going to happen, because it has happened since the first Honda plant opened here 40 years ago. The transplants are just simply going to raise their rates, their benefits, to very close, but not quite as high as whatever the UAW wins. They always do. They save maybe $1,000 a vehicle. Overall, they get a little more productivity out of their offers to their workers, and they keep the union out. They keep the workers happy, because they say to them, look, just like you mentioned, Bob, how much did they lose striking? How much did it disrupt? It took market share, risked your jobs. Don't strike. Don't we do a very good job taking care of you? We're the benevolent company. And that's what's going to happen now.
I think, though, you have to recognize that things have changed. This is labor's moment. 3/4 of the companies support the UAW in this strike. And we have union victories all over the place. Look what the Teamsters did with UPS. The top rate for drivers at UPS now is $47 an hour. That's very attractive.
Yeah, I don't.
And I don't know.
That makes a good point here. Package delivery cannot be outsourced to China. It can't be moved down to Mexico. They have a captive market here, and UPS can easily pass the cost on to the customer. In the auto industry, that's not the case. The market determines what the price of any vehicle is going to be. As an automaker, you can subtract out what profit you want to make at that price point, and what's left over is your cost. And if you can't meet that cost, you're screwed. You lose money, maybe you even go out of business in the long run. And that's the real difference here is, and this is why I question whether Shawn Fain and his new cadre of leaders see the big picture. This industry is going through a massive transformation. It's not just EVs. It's the move to software-defined vehicles. It's trying to drag legacy suppliers along into this new centralized zonal computing architecture. There is a big hurdle to be overcome. There's massive strain in the industry without the UAW issues. now add in huge increases in labor costs on top of everything that's going on, and a strike that is absolutely crippling smaller suppliers. If this goes on another 2 weeks, we're going to see irreparable damage being done, in my opinion. I don't think the union sees this.
I think we've heard irreparable damage many a time before. I mean, the first strike I covered was back in '78. So I mean, we've heard that every time. We hear the same arguments on both sides. And to Keith, your point, I agree.
Oh, there was irreparable damage. In 1978, there were 1.5 million UAW members. The Detroit 3 had, what, 80% of the market? Today, they've got 40%. There was irreparable damage back then. You just don't see it immediately. It takes years for that to play out.
I would argue that the vast majority of that was bad management. I mean, I came into the business, you and I know
management plus crippling pension costs, crippling healthcare costs, and a jobs bank where each of the Detroit 3 were paying $1 billion a year to people for not to work. I mean, it was boneheaded management decision to agree to those things.
Well, yeah, but how much, just if you look at GM's market share, how much of that was from A cars that you couldn't sell alike?
Agreed.
And other cars that the paint peeled off and they wouldn't help.
Right. No. Hey, look, I'm not going to exonerate management at all. I mean, Deming said it. Management's at least 80% of the problem. And he said, and as long as I'm thinking about it, maybe it's 90%.
And also you have to remember, when the UAW and all the other unions were at their highest level of membership, it was pre-Reagan. And an inflection point back then was what? The air traffic controller strike, where they started to use permanent replacements. Before that, we all thought permanent replacements was a strange phrase, never used, sort of theoretical concept. And back prior to 1980, there were many, many more strikes, even than there are now. And so they made the decision, that is, the management negotiating team made the decision, let's do what we need to do to put the industry back to work. But it makes me think that when Bill Ford went on and made a plea, he made some of the plea was, let's get back to the business of building cars, but also let's avoid this irreparable damage to the industry. And it might not happen in a year. I think we're going to have to look at this historically to see precisely where everything goes. But, when I talk to my colleagues, all of which don't want to be named, there are people in the UAW that are trying to influence this shift away from this type of strike activity. And even within the companies, they're scratching their head on this stuff. Does Fain actually have a number in his head that once it's reached, he said, okay, everybody go back to work? Because it almost sounds to me, until the autos say, this is my last offer, my last best and final offer, he won't make that decision. They are going to have to, at some point, say, enough is enough. Play your next hand, UAW.
All right. So that was the headline of a story I just posted on Headlight.News just a little while ago. Gerald Johnson, the head of manufacturing at GM, just issued a 5.5-minute video in which he essentially said enough is enough. He didn't use those words, but it was exactly what he said. We have given you $39.24 an hour is your average. The average worker will make $80,000 in pay. And when you add in bonus and profit sharing and overtime, many, quote unquote, many of you will take home $100,000 a year or more. When you add in all of the benefits you get, the number he quoted, $150,000 per worker. And he wrapped up by saying, you are in the top 30% of all American workers, not manufacturing, not just blue collar. You are in the top 30% of all American workers.
But doesn't it seem that the longer it takes, the more money they get? So if you're a UAW worker, you basically say, hey, I'm in no hurry because Shawn is doing a hell of a job for me, because it just goes up, 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 and up.
The only pattern we're creating here is not in the terms and conditions of the agreements. We're creating a pattern in terms of the direct actions of the UAW and other unions to use a strike to get the companies to go beyond their last offer. And we've done that a number of times in the industry by going to multiple ratification votes and sweetening the pack. We have trained these folks to do this. But you have to say, if Fain could get a fraction of a percent more or 1% more, somebody has to be doing a cost-benefit analysis on the hurt it's causing to his membership to be out just to get that little increase on the margin to satisfy his desire to be the president that got the big package. Somebody has to be doing that.
I think that Fain, his goals go way beyond the auto contracts here. He sees this as the modern inflection point. If the air traffic controllers strike was the inflection point for the decline of unionism in America, this is the inflection point for its rise. And, you know, all these new labor leaders that we've been talking about are having all this success, organizing Starbucks, organizing all these new companies. And he sees an opportunity finally to reverse that slide. It wasn't 1.5 million, John, in 1978. It's 400,000 right now. He sees an opportunity to organize Tesla. This is not pie in the sky. This is what he truly sees as an opportunity. And the calling card, the best way to do that is to get a very rich, historic, generous contract. So this is way beyond just what he gets out of Ford, GM, and Stellantis. This is about the future of the UAW and the labor movement in the United States. They feel like they have the wind at their back right now. Coming out of the pandemic, the American public is more supportive of unions than they have been at any time since the 1950s. They don't trust employers. They aren't happy about how they were treated during the pandemic. They need protection. So unions have their moment, and that's what he's trying to seize.
Right. Totally agree, Keith. In fact, I would argue that Shawn Fain has a moral obligation to his membership to organize the transplants and the startups. Because if he gets this big pay gap and they are able to maintain the labor cost advantage that they have right now, it's a threat to his union membership.
It is.
I mean, he complains that when he hears about the need to be competitive, he hears a race to the bottom. When I hear an argument about not being competitive, that's a race to going out of business. If you're not competitive, you're going to get bulldozed out of the way in this industry.
Well, the unions are winning more and more NLRB elections, more than 75% margin of victory in terms of the petitions that are filed. And what I'm advising our clients to do is obviously get the best deal you can on market rates, but protect operational agility and efficiency and flexibility. The market, to a certain extent, is going to determine what the wage and benefit settlements will be. Even in the non-union, they can't avoid the market impact. And with Fain getting much bigger, actually, the OEMs providing much larger wage and benefit increases, that'll have a whipsaw effect on everybody. It will move the market. And, you have to think about our industry with a lot of it in the Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, Ohio area as a trading block. And that trading block will go up and down together. And that'll make everything more expensive. It'll also make the settlements larger. So agility, operational flexibility, protecting managerial prerogatives as best as they can, that is still quite doable.
And all this
so you're talking about the factory floor here, Timmy, just so our viewers can get an understanding of what you're talking about in terms of agility and flexibility.
So first off, if you are in a unionized facility, let's say you want to put somebody into an open position, you might have to move 3 or 4 or 5 people to get the one person in that position. That is absolutely the outcome of a seniority system that's negotiated. So being able to move people quickly and flexibly to the places where they're best used, very important. To set up and bring to a conclusion certain lines of business, very important. There cannot be any impediments to that. And of course, in this industry, anything that damages our ability to keep production flowing is a major problem. So it's really important for any employer to understand what their organizational imperatives are: cash, profitability, flexibility, and make sure in all their relationships with the workforce, whether union or non-union, that they are able to fortify those organizational imperatives.
You know, I want to get back to something Keith said. Keith, you're absolutely right. All the studies show that people are very dissatisfied with employers in general, and union support has gotten to a level that we haven't seen in a long time. There was a great chart on the front page of the New York Times. I think it was late last year or early this year, which showed wages, income for different classes of Americans. And what it showed was CEO pay and the billionaire class, everything was skyrocketing. It looked like a missile taking off, where the average American, at best, it was like this, and in many cases, it went down for many of the sectors of the economy. Now you add the fact that first we have inflation. We've seen prices on vehicles. A great example: prices on a new vehicle average now about $48,000. Once you talk about average transaction prices, what it costs to take the vehicle home, that's over a third more than it was as recently as 2016, well above the rate of inflation. The reality is, with rare exceptions, there aren't many young people. There aren't many people who are getting into the market who can afford a new vehicle. And people are getting very frustrated. They can't afford that. They can't afford to buy the food that they like. They can't afford to go to concerts anymore. They can't afford to buy homes. This is setting off a chain reaction. A lot of the political dissatisfaction that we see is, in various interpretations, all about this frustration. And it's weird because it echoes in different ways on left and right of the spectrum, but it comes from the same sort of area. So that's why I think the union strikes that we've seen and the strong demands are actually echoing well. You don't hear people saying, oh, those greedy auto workers. They're agreeing more and more, those greedy bosses.
Yeah, great point. Hey, thanks for that, Paul. But we got to take a quick commercial break right now. We got stuff to come back. And when we come back, I want to ask about the impact of all this labor stuff on the electric vehicle segment. And Keith, think about that, because I want to come to you on that. But first, a shout out to our sponsor, Bridgestone.
How do Bridgestone tires stop shorter on wet roads? It's their HydroTrack technology. But you don't have to know how the science works, just where the brake is. What really matters is their Bridgestone.
And thank you, Bridgestone, for supporting this show. So, Keith, as you know, Ford was going to build this battery plant in Michigan with CATL, biggest battery manufacturer in the world from China. They've paused that directly because of the labor negotiations. Now we see General Motors delaying its electric pickup by a year. There's issues, maybe that the take rate isn't going as strong as they thought it would be. But now there's this, and Bob alluded to this earlier, this deepening concern of how do we deploy our capital? We got to be very, very careful about where and when we put it. So I'd just like to get your reaction. What do you think these labor negotiations are doing to the EV segment? And then where does that leave the Biden administration? Joe Biden's most pro-union president ever, he says, and he's also trying to push electric vehicles. I see a head-on collision with administration policies here.
Absolutely. And picking up on what Paul just said, there is an affordability crisis in the industry in general. Electric vehicles, if regular vehicles are $48,000 average transaction price, electric vehicles are $60,000. None of what's happening right now is going to make electric vehicles more affordable. And yes, there is a demand problem now with electric vehicles. You could see it in Tesla's earnings yesterday. Their margins keep shrinking and shrinking, and they are not getting the volume. They had a decline in sales in the third quarter for the first time in several quarters. They're not getting the volume you would expect from all the price cuts that they are doing, because we are getting to this next level of electric vehicle buyers, the mainstream. The early adopters have already got their electric vehicle or two. So now you're getting to regular people and they're saying, wait a minute, I can't afford a $60,000 vehicle that I don't know if I'm going to be able to find enough chargers to get from point A to point B for. So there's a big pause on electric vehicles. And that plant in Marshall, Michigan, the battery plant, Ford is pausing it for three reasons. One is labor costs, for sure. They don't know what they're going to be yet, so they can't commit to this $3.5 billion plant until they know that. But the other is EV demand. And the third element is what's going to be in the IRA. How much of a government subsidy am I going to get for making batteries here in the United States? That's not clear yet. That still needs to be worked out. It does leave Biden really walking a tightrope. How can you be the most labor-friendly president and then have this very aggressive green agenda? He wants half of the cars sold in America by 2030 to be electric. And increasingly, no industry expert is predicting that's going to happen. The auto companies think it'll be maybe a third, and that might be aggressive.
So when I heard Shane announce that he had pulled in the joint venture battery program to the master agreement at General Motors, it shocked me because, Paul, you hit it right on the head. Our law does not allow something like that to happen where you have two employers, and where you have a joint venture, you have two joint employers. I am not quite ready to say that was an accurate statement on Fain's part. I want to see what General Motors has to say about it, because I'm not so sure that they pulled the whole thing under the UAW master contract. If they did, that was a massive win for the UAW and a massive loss for General Motors.
And GM has said nothing. It's been crickets.
They've said nothing. So are we going to just believe what Fain said? I'm not quite that naive to say that's the full story. I don't think you guys are either.
No.
So our friend Joe White, who was on the show, I think it was 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, had a piece in Reuters today, which I want to quote from, because it goes to your point, John, about the Biden administration, and Paul, to your point about the IRA. So quoting Joe, in effect, Fain is demanding that workers get a greater share of the $35 per kilowatt hour in U.S. government battery cell manufacturing subsidies the plants hope to recap from U.S. President Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. The flow of cash flow from the IRA could be substantial. For example, 1,300 workers at GM's Ultium battery plant in Northeast Ohio could someday produce 35 gigawatt hours of batteries annually, or 13 kilowatt hours for each hour in a worker's 40-hour week. At full capacity, the plant could generate an average of $454 in subsidies per worker per hour in return for wages starting at $21 per hour, based on figures disclosed by Ultium. So there it is, that Shawn Fain looks at that number and says, you know what? That's not fair to the workers.
Absolutely. It feels like the workers are getting left behind at these battery plants. And, let's face it, Ultium initially was paying wages at that plant that were the equivalent of working at McDonald's. So they've raised them since, but there's still a lower pay rate. They're $20 to $24 an hour. The top rate at UAW, master agreement is $32 an hour currently, heading for 40. So they need to close that gap somehow, or all those workers who are in internal combustion engine powertrain plants right now, who might find work at a battery plant, are going to take a huge pay cut.
Yeah, but here's the problem. Here's the challenge, is that the only cost problem with electric cars is the battery. That's it. Everything else is cheaper. And if the Detroit 3 are locked into significantly higher labor rates, and I'm not saying that the workers don't deserve it or shouldn't get it, I'm just saying if you're the Detroit 3 and you have the highest labor costs on the highest cost item in an electric car that's going to make or break the whole EV industry, you're screwed. I mean, and this is why I come back to the moral imperative that Shawn Fain has to organize the transplants and the startups. Because as good as it will be for those workers, it could lead to the long-term demise of the Detroit 3, especially in the EV segment.
It is a vicious cycle with EVs. The only way to get the price really down is to get volume, and you can't get volume at $60,000 a car. So they got to find a way to increase volume, and right now it's not going in that direction.
But you know, one of the questions I'm going to be looking at when all this is done, we hear about wages, we hear about time off, we hear about retirement and medical and so on. What else is there that is going to be aimed at improving productivity? I mean, that's been an issue for what, 30 years now in all the contracts. So when we've seen good contracts, as we saw before the Great Recession, there were some good jumps in what the workers got. But the UAW also granted significant improvements in productivity. If I'm correct, and John, you or Gary may be the most likely to remember this. Maybe Bob, you have it. If I'm correct, the percentage of the cost of today's vehicle that is attributable to labor has actually gone down quite a bit over the last 30 years. So, yeah, wages and all that stuff has gone up, and yet at the same time, you're spending less when you buy a car to pay workers.
Yeah, but part of that has just got to do with the price of the vehicles. So let's say in an assembly plant, a good assembly plant is probably 25 labor hours per vehicle. If that vehicle costs $30,000, your labor cost is a much more significant chunk of that than if you're making $110,000, Escalades or Grand Wagoneers. So one of the reasons that it shrunk is simply because the price of cars has gone up so bloody high.
Yeah, but then the amount of hours, I remember when it was pretty good if Detroit got down below 40 hours.
No. I mean, in the day when we saw the Harbor Report, and we haven't seen that in years now, over a decade. I mean, Ford Atlanta making Fusions was an 18-hour car. They, and now with more content, undoubtedly that number's gone up. But, look at what Tesla's doing with this unboxed assembly process and with its gigacastings. It's taking labor hours, cost out simply through design. And I come back to is knock, knock, knock. Hello, hello. Is anybody home at the UAW? Don't they see what's going on here?
And Toyota is one in particular who is talking very aggressively about gigacasting. So we know that other automakers are there. I know that Hyundai's been looking at it, and I've gotten a hint that GM is looking at it in several different areas.
GM's got them, and what's the big 400,000? The Celestique's got gigacastings.
Right. Yeah, but that's a $300,000 car. Oh. So it gets back to my point. It'll be very interesting to see if buried in the details of this contract, whatever it is, or these contracts, whatever they are, if there will be some concessions to the manufacturers that do let them help recoup some of the cost by taking advantage of the lower manufacturing costs that EVs are going to have.
Yeah. Bob, what do you think?
Labor costs as a percent of sales for the OEMs is significantly different than labor costs as a percent of sales for the suppliers. If you look at Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, on average, the labor cost of total revenues is somewhere around 5%. But if you go into the suppliers, it can be anywhere from 25 to 35%. And when they negotiate a rich contract with the OEMs, there's a whipsaw effect that goes through the entire supply chain of the auto supply industry that's going to make all those other wage adjustments, union or non-union, higher. That's going to make the component prices higher, which will be the component price that the OEM has to increase their spend on, and the cost of the car is going to go even higher than that. I was talking to the one guy, he said, we talk about labor costs as a percent of sales with the OEMs around 5%, but when you put it all together, it's probably closer to 10 or 11 because this is a highly interdependent industry, and all these costs end up going into the bucket of labor. Right. I think it's going to be just a much more expensive. The other thing is, history tells us this, both in the UAW and in other places, when you raise the cost of labor, employment goes down. John L. Lewis, for the mine workers, negotiated a massive wage increase in the 40s, even though it led to 25% of the miners being laid off.
Huh.
I can't help but believe there will be massive productivity increases, and many, many fewer auto workers will be used, many fewer.
Hey, Bob, while you're at it, the pass through that will go to suppliers. What about the white collar workers? I mean, they're going to be looking at all this. There's engineers now who are going to be going, hey, wait a minute. I'm not making as much money as the guys on the line. And I went to school for 4 to 6 years to be able to get this job.
Well, a couple things. For decades now, the salaried workforce has been rooting behind the scenes for every negotiations because they want to get the same thing the auto workers did.
Right.
But when you talk to them about their sentiments about the company and what workers deserve, I can't remember who said it a little earlier, but there's a general support for the worker and against management, even among the salaried folks. Now, I haven't done a survey, but you talk to enough of them and you hear it, you have to believe, well, maybe there's a growing sentiment that, you know, life in the autos is just too difficult and something has to happen.
Keith, did Ford say that they're protecting all of the jobs and that, you know,
Yeah,
as they move to...
I was just
to
going to
what?
say that, Gary. Yeah, they have said they will not be cutting any jobs during the life of this contract, and the union is looking for a 4-year, 8-month contract, and all the companies are fine with that. And in fact, Ford has said they expect to be hiring workers during the life of this contract. You know, they're making this big transition. They still need their internal combustion engine business to crank out all the profits to pay for the electric vehicle business. So they'll be running basically 2 companies simultaneously, and it'll take a lot of people. But to Bob's point, you know, it takes 40% less labor to assemble the powertrain for an electric vehicle than it does to assemble the powertrain for an internal combustion engine vehicle. That math will play out at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Which gets to the point, you know, John, you were talking about, you know, Tesla doing these manufacturing improvements and designing cost out of all of their products, you know, and including their batteries, including their motors, including everything they make. And so it seemed to me that it would be exceedingly difficult for Ford, say, to compete with Tesla if Tesla is able to even further reduce the direct labor hours per vehicle, while Ford has to perhaps artificially keep, you know, X number of workers working, even though they may not need them.
Yeah, and this is one of the problems that gets into having the UAW on board. Bob, you talked about this earlier. Lines of demarcation, work rules. You guys all know it. You know, if a piece of machinery's got to be plugged in, the line worker, you got to get an electrician to do that. A piece of wood is on the floor, just on the floor, you need a carpenter to go pick that up. A millwright's got to do this, an electrician's got to, I mean, there's so many work rules that you do not see at the transplants. Takes almost 4 years to get your journeyman's card to be a skilled tradesperson at any of the Detroit 3 automakers. Honda, they don't call them skilled trades. They call them maintenance workers. Takes 2 years, and they're trained in everything. Everything. You're not an electrician. You're not a millwright. You're not a die setter. You're all of that. You're trained in all of those things. And if you look at Honda's uptime, it's awfully damn good. So it's not a problem, you know, in the way that it's doing it. And these are some of the hidden costs, you know, the hidden costs of having UAW people, local people that are essentially on the company payroll, but they're not building vehicles. They're not building anything. They're doing union work. So when we talk about the cost per hour of the line worker, I'm telling you, it goes way beyond that. And that's the saddled cost that the Detroit 3 face against their non-union competitors.
And the other competitors have younger workforces without legacy benefits.
Yeah. Can I throw one question out? Bob, you may have the best view on this. I'm not sure. Which of the automakers, the transplants and Tesla, do you see as most likely that the UAW would be most likely to succeed in organizing?
None of them. I mean,
Tesla workers are angry as hell.
Yeah, but you have to remember, a year ago, Musk invited the union to come in and do an election, not to go through the lengthy campaigning period, and the union demurred on it. With unions, they have to do two things. They have to organize and they have to negotiate and administer contracts. Some unions are great at organizing. Some unions are great at the contract administration and negotiations. The UAW is not a great organizing union. It's a great negotiating union and it's a great administration union. You don't have to look back more than a handful of years to see how much money they've spent on the transplants and have not hardly converted a single one of them.
Not a single one.
Well, they haven't been great at organizing auto workers for sure. I think they're winless. But in organizing grad students and casino workers, they've been wildly successful.
And public sector. They have also been very, very good at the public sector.
Yep.
Yeah. But, we're not talking about those industries.
Right. So look, I mean, the Detroit 3 employ about 148,000 Americans, that are UAW workers. The transplants plus the startups employ 128,000. So they're really closing the gap fast. And there is over a dozen foreign manufacturers and startups in the United States. They have massive manufacturing facilities. They make millions of vehicles in the U.S. every year. They employ 128,000 line workers, all of whom are non-union. Mm-hmm. And, they have gone into rural areas to set up their plants. So you can't get a better job within a 100-mile radius. You just can't do it. They pay the best wages. And when people start talking about the union, they go, really? Where are you going to get a better job than what you got right now? Look at all those guys in the union that went to jail. They say they're clean now, but are they really? And, you got a problem, you come talk to us. We bring a union in, you talk to the union, and the union comes to us. And look at all those people out on strike right now. They're making $500 a week. Are you sure you really want to go through with all of that? And so that's why I agree with Bob. I don't think they stand a chance of organizing the transplants, even though I maintain Shawn's got a moral obligation to get it done.
So the last transplant that had any level of union organization was in the mid to late 70s, and it was called VW in Pennsylvania.
Westmoreland.
There you go. And to really give you a little more of an insight, Toyota and Nissan, maybe Mercedes US, they have all done a very, very good job of addressing their employees' concerns. If I had to stratify it, maybe the Koreans are more vulnerable. But, the UAW just has had a really bad record of organizing them, and I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Right.
They lost, excuse me, John. They lost the VW vote. VW in Kentucky Tennessee, seemed absolutely ready to have the union start negotiating. Yeah. And it was the workers who blocked them, not management.
Yep. It's amazing, isn't it?
Well, the Southern strategy has been very successful in keeping unions out of the newest auto plants.
For the new ones, right. But, here's a good stat, that talks to, I think, the sentiment of the non-union workers at the transplants. And Bob, this, Stellantis presented in its first proposal a bunch of stats, one of which was their average absenteeism is like 21%. It's crazy. The absenteeism at Toyota and Honda is 3%, and that's scheduled absenteeism. I got to go to the doctor. I got to take my kid to a special school project. So scheduled absenteeism is just that. What I call AWOL, and the industry calls unscheduled absenteeism. It's not out of control at all UAW plants. Some of them are actually quite good. It varies by region. But in some places, it's out of control, and this is not a new issue. The big three have been complaining about that since the 80s.
Well, we measure pay for time not worked, and in the unionized facilities, it's much higher than it is in the non-union facilities. Now, granted, most absenteeism is not paid for, but if it's not scheduled, it has a negative impact on the operations. To pay workers to do nothing, that is to not be at work, is a big drag on the business. some of it's legally required, but some of it isn't. It's just what happens in union settings.
Keith, I've got a question for you, and then I want to ask Bob a question. And so to Keith, the question I have is, after Bill Ford made that presentation, and the response was, this, as Paul mentioned before, the tweet from Shawn Fain basically saying, if Ford wants to be the all-American auto company, they can pay all-American wages and benefits. Were the people at Ford surprised at that reaction? I mean, when you talk to your sources there, I mean, what was their response?
The big surprise was within Shawn Fain's statement. You might have the whole statement in front of you, Gary.
Yeah.
He makes a reference to Bill Ford threatening to close the Rouge. Well, I was there. I did not hear him threatening to close the Rouge. So, and actually, if you keep reading in the Fain statement, he threatens to close the Rouge. but I guess Bill made, because then, the UAW had to kind of come back and explain why they accused him of that. And Bill Ford made a kind of a reference to, if, we don't come up with a good agreement, it'll cost jobs or cost plants. He didn't ever say it'll cost the Rouge.
There's a picture of the Rouge behind him when he was speaking. So maybe
and we were at the Rouge.
We were at the Rouge.
That's where we were at. But so I think they were a little bewildered by that. I one of the things Bill Ford said before he gave that speech to the reporters who were there is that, the rhetoric is super heated in these talks, more heated maybe than any of us have seen. But you can't, he's counseling his executives, you can't take that personally, because when this thing is over, we all have to work together. We all have to come together again. So if you hold grudges over all of the, insults and bricks that have been thrown, that's just going to be counterproductive in the long run. It is a very, we've never seen, I haven't anyway, and I've been covering talks since the 1990 contract with Owen Bieber. We've just not seen this level of not just rhetoric, but sort of openness. They are openly negotiating in the public. That was, completely contrary to the way it used to be done. But every new offer, they either do a press release on it or the numbers leak immediately.
Yeah.
And Bob, I want to ask you, is that, this acrimony that seems to exist in this period right now, I mean, how does that get resolved?
I know Bill Ford enough to realize that he takes that seriously. I think Bill Ford has a way of getting past the rhetoric. It goes with the fact that he plays. He can take it out on some of those guys from the union by banging him into the wall on the rink when he's playing hockey. But I think Bill is the type that knows how the game is played. There's sort of a patrician element to that. One of the questions I have,
well, hold on, Paul, because I know Bob's got a hard stop at the top of the hour, and I want to give him the last word. I know, Gary, you were going to ask.
Give me 2 seconds.
Because he's got an absolute hard stop. But anyway, go ahead, Bob. Final thoughts.
Final thoughts. This will all be over at one point. We'll all be rushing like crazy to get it back on track. Each one of the companies is already training its supervisors how to welcome everybody back. And as long as this thing doesn't go too long, they will be back on track, enjoying the best wage and benefit package that they've ever had. I have a lot of faith in the industry and the smart people in it. And I just hope the damage isn't going to be irretrievable.
Yeah. Good. Bob, thanks for that. You may go now. I'm going to get some final thoughts from everyone else, but I know you had a very hard stop that you had to get to. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. We'll have you back.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Paul, closing thoughts.
Yeah, just what I was going to say. The thing I hope is that Shawn Fain can get past his own rhetoric. This is a guy that almost immediately after being elected in a very, very testy runoff ballot declared the automakers the enemy. And what I'm not sure yet, because nobody knows him well enough, is this pure rhetoric and he knows how to get beyond it? Or is that really revealing Shawn Fain? And if Shawn Fain is a guy that truly thinks these guys are the enemy and have to be treated like the enemy even after a good contract, the industry is going to have problems.
Yeah. Keith, final thoughts.
Yeah, my thoughts are, how close to the end really are we? Because, even though it seems like they're very close on the economics, it still feels like there's a big chasm on the battery plants. And I kind of took as a bad sign this week that GM postponed its investor day that was scheduled for next month. They're moving it to, I think, March. And that Chrysler said it's pulling out of CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, because of the strike. That CES is in January. How long do these companies think this strike is going to last?
Right.
So I feel like we are not really that close to the finish line.
Right.
Well, I think one thing, Keith, if I may, real quickly, don't be surprised that the automakers are loading a lot of stuff on the strike that they might otherwise have to explain differently. Like pulling out of CES, it may be a case of just doesn't do any benefit to us. Let's blame this.
Yeah, maybe. Gary, final thoughts.
I think that both Paul and Keith did a very excellent job at describing, the social context in which we are existing in terms of labor versus the wealthy class. And I think that, this UAW strike is a concentration of those concerns. And I'm just afraid that if the rhetoric rises, then there could be, further disruptions within all kinds of industries. Keith mentioned the, grad students and workers at Starbucks and so on. I mean, it could spread like wildfire. And I just don't know who has a good handle on that.
Yeah. I guess my final thought is that, if Shawn Fain wanted to declare victory this afternoon, as Bob just pointed out, all his workers would get an unbelievable contract. But that's not what this strike is about. And I think you alluded to this earlier too, Paul. They tipped their hand. We saw the memo that got leaked. They want to do damage to these companies for months. We're only 1 month into it. That memo said that they wanted to do it for months. And I support all these workers getting a much better deal than what they've had, a much better deal. But now you're starting to damage the industry. And that's where my support for it stops.
Aren't we all happy?
Anyway, hey, this was a great discussion, guys. Really appreciate Paul. Love your input. Keith, you too. And Gary, I mean, that's what the show is about. Bringing, really good, informed discussion to our audience.
Indeed.
Okay. See y'all. Take care.
AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires. Solutions for your journey.
If you like this program and would like to learn more about the automotive industry, check out our website at Autoline.tv or look for us on YouTube on the Autoline channel.